See you.
Professor
Yeah.
Cummings.
Hello.
Wanjali from Future Consensus Institute.
Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
Ah, it's great. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And the setting is very lovely.
원래 여기가 제일 좋을 뻔했는데 사실.
여기서 하면 제일 좋은데.
So the future consensus, I hope there is a future consensus.
Yeah.
That's what we are going to talk about.
Yes, right.
Mr. Zhang,
Then I have CNN.
I see.
So yeah, this is a Future Consensus Institute interview, and we just wanted to invite renowned Professor Bruce Cummings and also renowned professors from Korea, who is an economic expert, Dr. Jo Yoon-jae, and also Dr. Bang Myung-lim, who is politics and historical expert. So this one.
I've known them both for many years. So.
Sure, yeah, of course. For the record, I'm
Yeah.
just saying this. So this the theme of this interview, we just had our focus on America changing and its impact in the Korean Peninsula and in the world order. So our first question was that is America changing? Like you said in your book, from east to west and Atlantic to Pacific, is that a meaningful change in American politics or American economy?
Well, I think that it's more meaningful today than when I wrote the book, because President Obama was not president when I finished that book, and early in his term, he announced a pivot to the Pacific, and I wasn't very surprised by that because, of course, the obvious thing is that China has become a rising power and, to some extent, an adversary of the United States. But also, as I wrote in the book, when you look at the west coast of the United States and the east coast of East Asia, so to speak, used to be called the Pacific Rim, but going from San Diego to Los Angeles, Silicon Valley, Seattle, and Vancouver, and then around to Tokyo and Seoul, Shanghai, Beijing, all the way down to Singapore and Hong Kong. That circumscribes the core of the world economy, the most dynamic, most rapidly growing core. It's high technology everywhere, very educated populations, and it will be like that throughout the 21st century. There's nobody else that's going to compete with a west coast of the United States integrated with a Pacific that is now, unlike in the past, the Pacific is the place where there's so many economic, commercial, technological transactions. What this has done is to put Europe in the shade, but it's more obvious today than it was then. If you think, what are the big European technology firms that we all use or think about? There aren't any. Google, Apple, Samsung. Companies like that are entirely dominant throughout the world, but you would expect that Europe would do better, and they haven't. But with the Brexit, this is the beginning of a, if not a split or partition, a centrifugal force in Western Europe that is very, very meaningful. The European Union still has the largest base of consumers in the world, including bigger than China, but that won't last very long. So we have basically in the US 70 years of Atlanticists looking toward Europe, and especially England, on the east coast of the United States. And their world is weakening. It's not disappearing, but it's weakening. One of the things that I wrote in my book is that all the power in the US is on the East Coast. We call it the Bosch-Wash corridor from Boston through New York to Washington. Financial power in New York, political power in Washington, cultural power in New York, and in educational power with Harvard and 30 or 40 other universities in Boston. That area looks toward the Atlantic, and it still has much more power than the West Coast. The West Coast doesn't even have a good newspaper anymore, let alone powerful politicians that people pay a lot of attention to. But what California and the West have is a very advanced technological position and strength. People have been predicting a shift from the East Coast to the West Coast, so-called power shift, for a long time, but it hasn't happened. But what has happened is the integration of the West Coast with Asia, with East Asia, and that's economically very, very important. The other thing I would say that is completely new and may not last very long, I was surprised by the Trump presidency because he's attacking the foundations of the post-war order, the alliances that we have with South Korea and Japan, or Germany, England, with NATO. He's attacking our allied base structure, saying that maybe we don't need bases in South Korea, Japan. They're not paying enough, and all that, even though they're paying a lot. He seems to think you're not paying enough. So that's being attacked, which is another fundamental structure. Politically, he doesn't seem to think we have any allies. I mean, the amazing thing is he doesn't talk about them at all. And above all, he's opposed to free trade, talking about tariffs and protectionism, which would lead to trade wars if he were to become president. So there are 3 or 4 fundamentals, big fundamentals of the post-war order that Trump is either fairly unaware of, or in any cases has been attacking during the campaign. And I don't know if it has long-run significance in the way he's talking about it, but the political ground has been cut out from under free trade in the United States. Hillary Clinton has to oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She's being criticized for her husband supporting NAFTA. That's something quite new. And it's worse than in the 70s when the first sort of rumors or hints of opposition to free trade were heard because of Japanese competition and things like that. It's worse because a lot of Americans are somehow become aware that trade is hurting them. To me, it's odd because I spent 3 summers working in a steel mill in Cleveland, Ohio, when I was in college, Republic Steel, in a in a coke plant. It was very hard work. Coke plant built in 1913. And I was working there in the 60s, and it was completely obsolescent. Well, it shut down about 10 years later. And I had an uncle living in Youngstown, a cousin in Akron, and these other small industrial cities in Ohio. By the 70s, they were all deindustrializing. And so for 30 years, this has been going on. And I don't even think it's gotten so much worse in the 90s. Maybe it has in the first decade of the 20th century because China has made big inroads on steel and things. But what I'm saying is the deindustrialization of the Middle West has been going on for at least 30 years. It was called the Rust Belt 30 years ago. Somehow, for the first time, it's becoming politically relevant. these are the supporters of Trump.
Yeah.
And that's why he's opposing free trade. That's why he's criticizing China. And so it's anachronistic that we would get a political fallout from this so long after it began to happen. But that's what is happening in this election campaign. I think the one result that is pretty clear is that the next president is going to have trouble defending free trade and free trade pacts. And that's something very new. So I'll stop there, but I think that that's something I hadn't quite anticipated when I wrote that book, that we would get a candidate like Trump who would go against all the fundamentals of the post-war world order.
Yeah.
So even though Trump loses this election, and you said it may not, this phenomenon may not last long, but if that is driven by the deindustrialization and some fundamental structural changes in the scene of economics, do you expect that will dominate the United States politics for a while?
I just think the political ground under free trade, which was very strong from literally 1941, when the war began, and Roosevelt had already passed the reciprocal trade agreement, and then at Bretton Woods in 1944, where the post-war economic order was shaped, that had tremendous support. Only crackpot politicians opposed it or criticized it. And I think the one result that is pretty clear is that free trade now has a shaky foundation in the political world. It may change, but I just saw a statistic that in the 10 years from 2000 to 2010, the U.S. lost 2.5 million jobs to China, or because of Chinese activities. And so it's one thing to lose jobs to Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when you didn't have just millions of jobs disappearing. But now, there is a huge problem with China and the migration of manufacturing jobs to China. So, you would think that it isn't a big problem because most of those jobs are low technology, old industries like steel and automobiles. But, the baby boom generation is a very large number of people born right after World War II, and many of the laborers, the union people, worked in those mills and auto factories in the Midwest and elsewhere. And they're now, in their 60s and 70s. And form a core of Trump's support.
Losing jobs to China's export is not just happening in the United States, but it's in Europe and almost
happening everywhere
in the world.
Yeah.
And we see similar rise in protectionism and isolationism in Europe. Do you think what's happening in the U.S. politics and Europe, would they be reinforcing each other and would be strengthened in the future?
Well, there are Trump-like figures in Europe. Boris Johnson, now the foreign minister of the British government, was going to be prime minister until the Brexit happened, and then he backed out. He's very much like Trump. He even combs his hair like Trump.
Even hairstyle.
And Urban in Hungary and the Polish leader. Austria may have a right-wing government. The election this month in Austria will be very important. And that signifies, I think, more trouble for Europe than Trump does for the United States. It's more trouble because Europe has a fairly recent history of right-wing regimes, of fascism. And so it's very scary to particularly older people who remember World War II and Hitler and Mussolini. George Soros, for example, who is a frequent commentator on politics everywhere, but he's very worried about the direction that Europe is going. The US has a much different political system. I've never worried about an extreme left or an extreme right in the US because the US has a tendency toward the middle, you know, over a long period of time. Somebody said that Trump wasn't, he didn't have enough energy to be a fascist. Ultimately, he doesn't care that much.
He looks to be very energetic man.
Yeah.
In his age.
He's too lazy to be a fascist. And in some ways, it's true of the right wing in the United States. It's modeled on Europe with European symbols, but you know, it's never been very strong as an extreme right wing. And the left wing keeps getting strength and losing it, and getting more strength and losing it. So I think it's bigger problem in Europe than it is in the US. Plus you have a much larger immigrant problem in Europe than the US has. So, and that stokes the right wing fires.
What makes American politics more balanced to the center than European politics?
Well, that's actually one of the major themes of my book. I built on an argument by Louis Hartz, a historian who wrote a famous book in 1955 called The Liberal Tradition in America. And he argued that the US never had a feudal past like Europe did. It had slavery, but that was confined to the South. And that most Americans from the beginning of the country were middle class, largely middle class farmers. And he argued that if you don't have feudalism, you aren't likely to have a strong right wing like the Prussian Junkers in Germany. And if you don't have a strong right wing and you have a big middle class from the beginning, you're probably not going to get a strong left either. So it's a simple argument, but a very interesting argument. No feudalism equals no socialism. So America is a born capitalist society. And it also spread over a continent without any previous social formations. In other words, in Korea you had to deal with a land problem after 1945, the same in China and most other countries. But we, you know, as white Americans expanded, they ran up against native hunter-gatherers that moved around but had not formed a settled agricultural society. And then when you get to California, which is the most productive agricultural land in the US, in the Central Valley, nobody ever farmed the Central Valley. The Mexicans put out cattle. So the latest technologies could be applied to fallow ground without a social formation preventing it. And so American social conflicts have been much different than European or Korean social conflicts. The land problem was a problem in the South for slavery, but not elsewhere. And that's a fundamental theme of my book. And it seems to me to explain a lot about American history and predict it too.
Viewing from both internal and external perspective, I think now America is on the critical turning point, as you said today and also in your book, from British colony to first nation state to Atlantic Empire to Atlantic and Pacific Empire, and now finally the first ever global empire. That's the brief history of the USA. It's also the civilization history of humankind. But now pivot to Asia is, I think, a response to the Chinese re-rise or Chinese peaceful development. But the problem is, the US in history has faced three rival empires, Japan, Soviet Union and China, outside the Western Hemisphere. But the problem is China is utterly different from two former empires. They have been very coercive, but China is very hegemonic, like the American empire. So I think the Trump phenomena is also some continuation of this pivot to Asia. Then in part this is some isolation policy and also the representative phenomenon of the polarization of the American economy and society. As you said, the liberal tradition still alive in America, the research said. So both internal and external situation, they lay the foundation of the Trump phenomenon, I think. So they think, Professor Cummings.
Well, it's true that our politics is more polarized than it has been for a long time. But in part, it's a kind of death rattle of the Republican Party, because for 2 decades now they've been pushing cultural issues like abortion, opposition to gay marriage, family issues. And they can win in Congress, but they lose the presidency. I mean, Bush had 2 terms, but he didn't really win the election in 2000.
Yes.
He lost the popular election by 500,000. From 1992, you've had 2 terms of Clinton, 2 terms of Bush, which were somewhat accidental, and then 2 terms of Obama. And there's been a steady deterioration of the Republican Party's position in the country. And it's one of the big reasons is that the demography of the United States is changing so much. A lot of Trump's support, I think almost all of it, comes from white men, often less educated white men. But the era of white men being dominant is ending in the United States. And so very large Hispanic groups, blacks, Asian Americans, they're almost all going toward the Democratic Party, new voters, new ethnicities. I just read an article about Asian Americans who, during the 1990s, and especially with H.W. Bush, they voted a majority for Bush. But they're a majority Democratic now, and they're 5 or 6% of our population. They've grown a great deal. Blacks are about 11%, and Hispanics are getting, I think, about 20%. So, in my own lifetime, you know, I've gone from white men dominant to white men being in a minority status, you know, within a few years. And the Republican Party is almost entirely white. It's amazing when, you know, they had the primary campaign this year. They had 13 or 14 candidates. One black man who was slightly crazy, the doctor, and 12 or 13 other white men. It looks like a country club instead of a political election. And they've run, you know, Mitt Romney and another white man who lost to a black man, John McCain. So the Republican Party is in a real crisis, and I actually don't think that has a huge influence on the country. It has a huge influence on the party system, because the Republican Party is in a situation where I don't know how they can start gaining more members. They just lose them. And Trump is reacting to that in part. But the Democrats are the majority party and going to be the majority party. But they represent what the majority of Americans think. Gay marriage is now legal. Abortion is not going to be overturned. Cultural issues like family are almost out the window because so many young people don't even bother to get married anymore. 40% of American children are born into families, either with just a mother or with a boyfriend, but not married. So that isn't a fundamental change. It's just that it's really hurting Republicans. I don't think it has a long-term effect on the direction of the party, except that it's going to be easier to elect Democrats than to elect Republicans.
Then I think the important question is, the liberal tradition can continue in America in the future time. In the history of American politics, yes, as you said, there has been no tradition of radicalism, socialism, but also extremism. But
Just
the Trump phenomenon is,
sporadic from time to time.
Trump phenomenon is some sort of extremism.
Right.
They try to stigmatize the minority, Hispanic, Asian, Black as anti-American or
Racist.
non-patriotic.
Yeah.
So under these circumstances, can that kind of liberal tradition still survive or continue?
Well, it's only a month
May
and
I add one
Sure.
more point to Professor? You said actually change in demography has a lot of impact on the development of American politics these days. And in the US, this change in demography is mainly the ethnic composition of demography.
right.
In Korea, it is mainly the age distribution of
Right.
demography. And what's your view that would a similar development could be observed in Korea? Here is more or less the generation conflict.
Right.
Young people are more liberal, and old people are more conservative.
Right.
So, can we expect similar development happening in Korea in the future, or in the near future, as what we have observed in the U.S. politics?
Well, Korea, Japan, and Italy all have very low reproduction rates, and they're all going to face, well, even China too, face the problem of young people having to support an enormous group of old people, retired people. People are living longer, but the demographic base for earning money is getting smaller. The U.S. doesn't really have that problem because of immigration, because our immigration laws are such that even if white Americans are not producing a lot of babies, the rate is very high among Hispanics and blacks. So the workforce is replenished in the U.S., and that kind of demographic problem will not affect the economy. I mean, it will affect the economy positively in that we don't have to worry about workers, finding workers, and supporting a huge old age population. But it does have a demographic effect that's very destructive on the Republican Party. They either have to change and be much more inclusive, or they're going to die. And Trump is in some ways the undertaker of the Republican Party, I think. I mean, the election is a month away. It's possible, I suppose, that he could win, but today it looks like he will lose very decisively. And the Republican Party is split very badly over Trump. And they're split over their future direction. So you're probably going to see a very different Republican Party coming in the future. But it doesn't really affect the United States as a whole. It doesn't have a huge effect because Republicans have been saying the same thing for a long time, and they haven't been winning.
If it's the case, would it have any impact on its international political position,
Not
especially
if
for Asian?
Hillary Clinton is elected. I expect she'll try and run a quasi-liberal foreign economic policy and national security policy. She will probably find some way to support the TPP by saying, well, it's been modified, so now I can support it. So I think the Clinton administration would be fairly predictable. It's just the Washington establishment of the 1990s coming back into power, really, except they're 20 years older now.
Then what you mean, the predictable?
Yeah. I mean, I was on a panel with Christopher Hill and Strobe Talbot yesterday, and Strobe Talbot was in the Clinton administration. And I know they can't wait for Hillary to be reelected so they can be reemployed.
In economic side, Larry Summers.
Right, right.
Bob
Robert
Rubin.
Generally speaking, for the last long time, yes, U.S. has been a token of some progress or some liberal tradition for the banner of, for the values of freedom, equality, peacemaking, or international order, settlement, welfare, inclusiveness. But with coming of the twin deficit and recent economic polarization, I have a strong doubt, comparative viewing from the European countries, or especially Nordic countries. Only in their, now America is the standard of material product, IT, technology, or language of English. Those kind of value standard or morality, I think, how can you expect the policy of Hillary Clinton's presidency?
Well, Hillary Clinton...
Still liberal or still progressive?
Yeah, neoliberal.
Neoliberal.
She has almost complete support in Silicon Valley among very, very wealthy people and Wall Street. Most of the Wall Street contributions are going to her and not to Trump. Very few Wall Street bigwigs, important top people, very few have endorsed Trump. They're embarrassed by Trump. Almost nobody. There's one guy in Silicon Valley who made all his money, I think, in PayPal. He's supporting Trump, but he's kind of a nutty guy. Generally speaking, the technology power and the financial power is completely behind Hillary Clinton. I think the big economic problem that she has to deal with is inequality. And that's basically a problem everywhere now. But the Piketty book that came out, on Capital, it really stimulated that, along with the Sanders campaign in the US, really stimulated a lot of attention to inequality. And there is tremendous inequality. So I think she'll have to address that in some way. But she's really has moved to the left of where she and Bill Clinton were in the 1990s. They were neo-Democrats. They were figuring the working class has to vote for us anyway, so we don't need to do much for the working class. Now the working class has really gone to Trump, and the problem of inequality is a huge one. So particularly if she wins big, which would mean also winning the Senate. I don't think she can win the House, but win the Senate is not too hard. I think you'll see social programs to address inequality. It's a problem that everybody recognizes now.
Then I have a question. How can you interpret that kind of simultaneous supporting both from the richest people, including Silicon Valley and Wall Street Journal, and also lower income strata, including Hispanics, Blacks, Asians? Hillary Clinton gets support both from this. How can I say? Extremely different.
Well, the best answer to your question is that the Republicans offer them nothing, and have offered them nothing for, I would say, decades.
Due to the collapse of the middle class, or
no? The Republicans just don't have problems that address inequality. When Mitt Romney ran 4 years ago, he famously said that 47% of the American people are on government dole, and that is one of the things that lost him the election. But he had his position on inequality was trickle-down economics. We will make the economy grow, and that will reduce inequality. But Hillary Clinton is going to have some kind of programs like the New Deal, to redistribute wealth, Probably she'll do it through taxation policy. But she has to do it because it's a problem that affects a lot of Americans and just has gotten to be an extreme degree of inequality.
So we had our institute, Future Consensus Institute, had an international forum for last 4 days, and we had Chinese, Russian, Japanese, and American delegates for the forum, and we were talking about New World Order a lot, and I was kind of very afraid as a Korean that many delegates from any country were very much concerned about the situation in the Korean Peninsula, not just in the short term, but also in the long term. And I think they commonly pointed out 2 points. One is American strategy to encircle China. The Russians were very concerned about that too. Chinese also. And also the other thing is the North Korea behaving, weaponizing with nuclear power. So those 2 things are big concern in this region, it looks like. So how would you address these issues in terms of what you explained, America looking like getting into a more liberal country?
Well, of the 2 questions, what to do about North Korea and the encirclement of China, my view is that the North Korean problem is not very serious, really. The North Koreans are engaged in deterrence, and if they ever used a nuclear weapon in anger, in a war, they would be completely destroyed and the regime would end. Colin Powell said North Korea would be turned into a cinder block, a yuntan.
Yuntan.
Yeah. And Hillary Clinton said something similar. The American war plans for North Korea just involved demolishing the entire country and using deep penetrating bombs and things to get to their military facilities underground. It's very frightening, but it's also, it's like a midget taking on Muhammad Ali if North Korea were to start a war or fire a weapon. They're not going to commit suicide. But I think they've been quite rational in responding to the threats against them since 2002, in that they cooperated with the Clinton administration to freeze the Yongbyon plutonium reactor. They cooperated in working out a missile deal right at the end of 2000. There were 4 power talks on ending the Korean War. A lot of progress was made in the late 90s. Then we have a crazy election in the United States, and in comes George Bush. First thing he does is say we don't want the missile deal. Second thing, he puts North Korea on the axis of evil. September 2002, he tables his preemptive doctrine, which results in the invasion of Iraq. And I read the North Korean press very carefully at that time, and from September right around to March 2002 and 3, they were saying Saddam Hussein is being invaded because he doesn't have atomic weapons. That's not going to happen to us. We're going to get a deterrent. And then they told very bluntly, publicly, they brought Americans like Siegfried Hecker over to see their deterrent. And then in 2006, they blew off their first atomic bomb. The Bush invasion of Iraq was catastrophic. We're seeing the results every day. But his North Korea policy was also catastrophic. They would not have developed nuclear weapons if it hadn't been for Bush's threats. And they were very real threats. So I thought, we're just playing right into the hands of hardliners in North Korea who want nuclear weapons. In any case, what happened is they got their nuclear weapons. And now they have missiles like, especially their new one, the Musudan, which is, it's a medium-range missile, but you can put one on top of the other and hit the United States, and it's solid fuel and it's mobile. So it's a very effective deterrent. The U.S. cannot be sure that one Musudan would not get through the THAAD or any other kind of anti-ballistic missile defense. But what I think is that a credible deterrent on the part of North Korea stabilizes the situation just from the standpoint of deterrence theory. There was not a war between the Soviet Union and the US in the Cold War because they both had nuclear weapons. But of course people get so worried because of all these ideas that Kim Jong-un is crazy or he's going to do something very rash. And I can't predict the future, but the past has been, since the Korean War, North Korea has been thoroughly deterred from starting another war.
Yes.
And they're probably feeling more secure than they were 10 years ago because of their arsenal of nuclear weapons and missiles. It's unfortunate that this had to happen, but I don't see how you can blame North Korea only. But in my country, in the US, nobody ever talks about what Bush did, including Democrats and Republicans. Neither one of them ever talk about it. And they're all united on sanctioning North Korea, hoping it collapses, you know, all of these things. Maybe the Russians and the Chinese genuinely worry that the US would bomb North Korea. I worry about it in the context of a preemptive strike, which Clinton almost did in 1994. And the North Koreans would respond by attacking the South or Japan or American military bases. But I was happy to see William Perry say a couple of weeks ago that a preemptive attack is out because you can't get these missiles anymore. The preemptive attack idea was they take their long-range missile, they put it on the base, they have to liquid fuel it. Takes hours. You can see it from satellites. And the minute they are about to launch it, you just hit it. But with the Musudan, you can't do that. And they even have a submarine-launched missile. I don't know if it's any good or not. But so I think there's a strategic stability growing up that makes the North Koreans more secure, even if the rest of the world thinks they're crazy and they're capable of anything. The problem of China is, of course, much greater because the U.S. does encircle China. I mean, the pivot is just one part of it. We've taken over bases in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, for example. There's a big Soviet base in Bishkek that we use to fight the war in Afghanistan. All around China, you know, Vietnam. We've been trying to make friends with Vietnam. Put a new base in Australia, in Darwin. Meanwhile, the U.S. already has an enormous power, naval and air power, near China. So it's very worrisome, and I think it's going to be the kind of worry that we will all have. I won't be around, but you might, you know, for the rest of the century, because the fundamental axis of world power now is between China and the U.S. And the good thing is it's a very mutually beneficial axis because everybody's making money. There's just huge interdependence between China and the U.S. But the bad side is China wants its proper place in the world, and the U.S. wants to keep China a regional power. Russia doesn't count because Russia is a third world country when you look at their oil exports and things, their natural gas exports. They have no competitive industries. All they have is nuclear weapons, and they can't use them. I mean, Trump said in the debate Sunday night that Russia's nuclear weapons are so much better than ours. Ours have been allowed to deteriorate. Everybody in the Pentagon must have been laughing when he said that. So anyway, Russia is a problem because Putin wants to restore some element of the Soviet Empire, some elements. But China is a very formidable adversary for the U.S. I wrote in the book, I'll just say one more thing, I'm sorry to interrupt. I said that China, in this book, that China was a more formidable adversary than the Soviet Union ever was. And that's because the Soviet Union never developed their economy beyond steel, lousy automobiles. A certain development of electronics and high tech for their military that was good, but not spreading through the society. This is just an anecdote, but I took a train from Moscow to St. Petersburg a couple of years ago. And it started off in the afternoon and then it got dark. And at dusk, hardly any lights come on in the villages. You see maybe one or two lights, probably the post office and the government office. They have outhouses instead of toilets. It's a backward country in many ways. But China is a formidable country, and so it's not surprising that China chafes at the kind of techniques the U.S. uses to contain it.
Okay.
Do you think the U.S. would be successful to contain China as a regional power? And I guess a related question is, would China be able to rise as a formidable power comparable to the United States? Because these two, in order to become a real global power, it's not just the military power or hard economic power, but they should have a comparable soft power,
right,
and the intellectual leadership in international organization, right, or the global issues like environment and global security problems. What's your view on the future capacity or ability of China to be able to rise to a global power which can rival to the United States in these areas?
Well, militarily, I don't think they'll be able to match the United States even 20 or 30 years from now. For example, the U.S. has 11 or 12 aircraft carrier task forces. China has one aircraft carrier that is obsolescent, and they haven't even learned how to land jets on the deck reliably yet. So as a naval power, China is much weaker than the Soviet Union was back in the 80s. Their air force is similarly weak. The U.S. has B-2 bombers that can take off in Kansas and bomb North Korea and come back to Kansas in the same day. So militarily, I think China would be stupid to try and match the U.S. the way the Soviet Union used to. Economically, China is very strong, but it does not have technologies that we don't have. There isn't a single technology that China has. Maybe in solar power or something like that, but it is building its technological power, but it doesn't rival the U.S. yet. In this book, I said China had only 2 supercomputers compared to about 20 in Japan and 50 in the U.S. Well, that's been completely changed. China has a lot of supercomputers now, although many of them are with Japanese or American components. But still, China doesn't have global flagship high-tech companies. China is just now beginning to learn how to make a good automobile, which Korea learned how to do 30 years ago. But the biggest weakness China has is in soft power. It doesn't have any ideas that other people like, except rapid export-led growth. It's a dictatorship that has a lot of trouble controlling its own people. And I don't think China can be a hegemonic power until it's a democracy. It has to democratize, and even then it would take quite a while for it to become hegemonic. Every hegemonic power, no matter how brutal their empire, whether the British or American or whatever, they've had a set of ideas that appeal to other people. Our Declaration of Independence, which was quoted by Ho Chi Minh, in 1945, that kind of thing. And I mean, I was actually at a conference at Chicago with several Chinese scholars there and graduate students, and I just decided to say, China doesn't have any ideas. It had a lot more ideas in the 60s when Mao was, you might not like the ideas, but they had a global impact in the third world. And they're all shaking their heads up and down. So that's a real problem. I think China should go back to the policies they were following under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao of a peaceful rise, or as Deng Xiaoping said, lay low and bide our time, rather than pushing things in the South China Sea and getting into trouble. It's very petty. It's not the way a great power operates.
So in your view, they are prematurely assertive in international issues.
That's right. And there aren't any ideas there either, except the 9-dash line. That's not an idea. And it happens not to be true. So there could easily be a lot of trouble between the US and China, but the fact is China is doing so well economically that I don't think they're going to go to the point of a crisis that would hurt their economy. Or let Sino-American relations, they wouldn't let them get so bad that the economic exchange would be hurt.
For the Korean Peninsula, I think there are two things, good and bad, exist simultaneously. One thing is good. Under the circumstance of the US-China rivalry, there has been no serious war, even the small civil war, no, or in the Pacific, Asia-Pacific areas and North Asian area. But US-USSR rivalry situation, there have been so many wars, Chinese Civil War, Korean War, Vietnamese War. So after the diplomatic normalization between USA and China is relatively peaceful and stable in this area. The second thing is very bad. I think US has lost so many times the opportunities for solving North Korean problem, including the Korean problem, post-detente, right after the demise of Soviet Union and the Cold War, and also at the time of the Geneva Agreement. So many times, yes, without normalizing the diplomatic relations between USA and North Korea, I don't think we cannot solve this problem at all.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think the US should stop trying to sanction North Korea and push it to the wall and threaten it with preemptive attacks and all these things, and should normalize relations with North Korea the way they have with Cuba and Burma and Iran. It's not going to happen for a while, I think, because the nuclear problem is still the one that people think is the only North Korean problem that needs to be solved. But that's the only way that the peninsula will be stabilized. It won't be unified, but it will be stabilized. So I completely agree with you. It's just a thorn in the side of everything in Northeast Asia, security, economics. I mean, North Korea is like some kind of an implant, that stops the flow of economic exchange in Northeast Asia. If it were suddenly opened up, you would have totally new pathways that would unify the region economically. Some Korean poet said that, as long as my peninsula is divided, it'll be like a nail in the flow of history.
Yeah.
But that's what North Korea is and has been. But it's a problem that could be solved fairly quickly, I think.
What should be the exit policy then? Now the tension has risen very strongly over the last 1 year or so.
Right.
And it's clear that U.S. and other U.S. allies cannot accept North Korea as a nuclear capacity country. And in the meantime, sanction has been strengthened. So what should be, what should be the exit policy from now?
To normalize relations with the quid pro quo, being capping their nuclear and missile programs so they don't get bigger. But you can't get them to denuclearize. I mean, they can hide an atomic bomb in one of the thousands of tunnels they have. I think that's a much easier problem to solve than the China problem. But I think when China looks at the world, it sees the U.S. as a major both partner and competitor. But when it looks at Europe, Europe is just receding in global power. Much more today than even 2 years ago when Merkel seemed to be running things for the European Union. Now the power has diffused. Brexit is the obvious example, but there'll be more. And the retreat of Europe from the world stage, not disappear or anything, but just slow lessening of its weight and its force in the world, means that the US and China are the dominant powers forever, for as long as we all live. And China should be happy about that. It doesn't need to have a lot of conflict with the United States. Their economies are mutually compatible, by and large.
So what you are saying is, for the time being, at least in our generation, U.S. supremacy would continue in the global community.
Yeah, because China doesn't have any capacity in the world organizations or in terms of ideas to overtake the U.S. and get a lot of other countries on its side. And Russia is behaving even worse. It's just behaving like a pre-World War II bully.
In that sense, I think the policy of Obama administration, so-called strategic patience, is also, I think, it's a failure.
It's a failure, and so is Park Geun-hye's policy hasn't gotten anything either.
Together, twin failure. Who are the winners of this policy? North Korea and the military industry of the USA, I think, both. North Korean nuclear capacity, including explosive capability, delivery vehicle, miniaturizing, standardizing capability, they developed so quickly, extremely, under the policy of strategic patience.
Yeah, that's right.
I really don't understand.
And North Korea now can play the US and China and South Korea off against each other. With the THAAD was a very bad decision because it estranged South Korea and China.
Exactly.
And it gives North Korea incentives to test atomic weapons or missiles. So the U.S. puts another THAAD in Japan or something, and pretty soon the region is divided. So it's funny that North Korea, I'm sure, recognizes that they have this capacity to cause trouble for the U.S., China, and South Korea. I wanted to say I have to get going in 15 minutes, and I want to make sure we can finish. I have to be at the dinner at 6:30. So
why don't we just focus for the rest of our time on what can or should Korea do in this situation?
Yes, that's right.
To overcome, I hope.
Well, I mean, South Korea is a very successful country in almost every respect except national unity with North Korea. Every time I come here, I'm more, again, impressed by the dynamism of the country and the young population, which is so well educated. I think South Korea's future is basically guaranteed because we're in an era of knowledge industries, and South Korea is one of the best educated countries in the world. The big problem is the one it's always had, which is North Korea. And I thought Kim Dae-jung had the answer to that, a long period of reconciliation where you give some benefits to North Korea and recognize their dignity and their interests, and over a long period of time try to slowly bring them under the rubric of a unified Korea. And I think sometime in the future somebody's going to come along and go back to that, because it's the only way. The idea of absorbing North Korea is not going to work. A war would be catastrophic. Yesterday at the conference, I got into a debate with Strobe Talbot when I said that we've had 25 years of people waiting for North Korea to collapse, and that it's not collapsing and it's not going to collapse, and therefore you should deal with it as it is, instead of as we would like it to be, which is William Perry's formulation.
Yeah.
And he said it's a grotesque, disgusting regime.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, you could have said that at any time in the past 70 years. But Roosevelt normalized relations with the Soviet Union in 1933 when Stalin was killing millions of kulaks. And Nixon opened relations with China when China was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, with no preconditions.
Yeah.
But I said the reason the US won't do that is they want North Korea to go away. They want it to disappear, collapse. They don't want to recognize any interest that North Korea has. And that makes it impossible for them to do what Roosevelt or what Nixon did. And they didn't really have an answer for that, but I know what they're thinking, well, Russia's Russia and China's China, but North Korea? And that's what they always think, that we don't have to deal with North Korea. Then about 10 minutes later, Talbot said the number one or maybe number two problem that Hillary Clinton will face as president is North Korea. I didn't say anything, but I mean, there's a complete contradiction.
Yeah.
You don't want to do anything for North Korea, but it's your biggest problem.
Yes. In economy, in democracy, and in the human rights, yes, South Korea is a successful country, but for the purpose of attaining the peace settlement of the Korean Peninsula, I have a strong doubt that there is no Polish option after taking again and again the conservative policy from Lee Myung-bok administration to Park Geun-hye administration. Now, as a divided country and part of North Korea, there is no Polish option toward the nuclear issue. So, I think I have a question to Professor Cummings. Yes. Yes, I think the Hillary Clinton would become the U.S. president. Then, is there any possibility to normalize the diplomatic relations with North Korea? I really don't understand. Yes, with the Soviet Union, with China, with Japan, with Germany, with Vietnam. After the end of the war with them, U.S. normalized within one generation.
Right.
But with North Korea, past 2 more generations now. So how can you expect, without this kind of normalization, I don't think we can finally resolve North Korean nuclear threat. And
well, the only American president that ever developed a true understanding of North Korea and how to deal with it is Bill Clinton in the last 2 years of his administration. He was making great progress, and he's also been back to North Korea as an ex-president. And he's going to be advising his wife in the White House. So I hope that he and the officials like Wendy Sherman and others who were in the Clinton administration will bring some progressive policies toward North Korea. It might not happen quickly. I imagine she'll talk tough for a while, but she has been called a hawk recently when she was Secretary of State, but her hawkish policies have turned to nothing. Libya, she was really behind the Libya intervention. It's a mess. She wanted to intervene in Syria. That wouldn't have worked, and Syria is a complete mess. So I think President Obama has set a kind of precedent for not using force every chance you get, that force doesn't solve many problems. And I hope she continues that policy. Actually, I hope President Obama might do something about North Korea before he leaves office, when he's, can get away with it, doesn't have to run for re-election. But I don't see much prospect of that.
Any comment on Korean diplomacy toward China or towards U.S.?
Well, I don't know if I said this already, because I've had several interviews, and but I think from 1992 until recently, South Korean diplomacy has been very effective regarding China. They kept the alliance with the U.S. while normalizing relations and having first a large trade, and then lots of people-to-people and cultural exchanges, so that I've thought the various Korean presidents handled China very deftly. And as a result, Chinese, a lot of them really love Korea. They love the soap operas and the K-pop, and they love to come here for visits. That kind of really ended, temporarily at least, with the THAAD decision. It was just a bad decision, but I still think it's been a very effective diplomacy. With Japan, it's hard to have an effective diplomacy when Abe is the prime minister, because he's so recalcitrant about the comfort women, and he goes to the Yasukuni shrine. He doesn't care to try and resolve historical issues. He just wants to make Japan a normal country, so-called. And unfortunately, he's got no opposition. The opposition is so unpopular that he's kind of prime minister for a long time, or the LDP seems to be in a position to rule Japan for quite a while. And I actually thought President Park was good in her first 2 or 3 years not to deal with Abe. So I don't have a lot of criticism of that kind of diplomacy. I think it's been pretty effective. And I think particularly with China, the Chinese have a very high opinion of South Korea. And my hope is they will eventually go in the direction that South Korea did in the 80s and 90s, which is to democratize. I mean, I know we're all critical of our democratic politics, but it's better than the dictatorships.
Since we have just 5 minutes, so any last comment or question?
Yes, Professor,
I enjoyed very much of listening.
you talked about the Clinton administration. I also think so. That combination, Clinton, Kim Dae-jung, the hawkish, not the dovish or moderate policy toward North Korea. But in case of being elected, the South Korean presidents from the liberal side or progressive side, then you can expect the second round of that kind of dovish combination toward North Korea in order to resolve North Korean nuclear issue.
I don't know. You all would know more about that than I do. I don't know Moon Jae-in personally, whereas I did know Kim Dae-jung personally, and therefore thought I could explain or predict his behavior a little bit. But I just don't see how the only policy that works is an engagement policy. All the others, haven't worked before or after Kim Dae-jung. They just don't work. And now decades and decades have gone by to prove that sanctioning and threatening and isolating don't work. But I guess we will see.
I think we should let him
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Will I see you next week, or you're going to be around? You're not going to Jeju.
May I ask an autography for Future Consensus Institute?
네, 네. 그리고 보지슨 인터넷에 가능하기 때문에 이렇게 하겠습니다. And
Next week is Jennifer's wedding.
Next week is.
Jennifer's wedding.
Oh, that's right. What day is that?
It's Friday.
A week from Friday.
I wish I could go.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, 감사합니다, 교수님. 감사합니다. So your Korean is great.
Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you. And this Future Consensus Institute, we are focused in Korea, China issues and Northeast Asian issues. So that would be great if you could ask you further advices.
Yeah,
Even
I think
after
it's great. I
you're
love
going back.
the room.
Yeah.
You know, and,
Thank you. Thank you.
So you should keep contact.
Yeah.
you know, when I was in the Peace Corps, I lived up near here, not far from here,
Yeah.
north of the Blue House.
Oh.
They used to call
Here.
it Segumjeong. on the
Yes.
way up.
세검정
Yeah.
is
It's
just
right
right
Yeah,
there.
I went
Just
right through
there.
there on the way to my house.
Ah.
I can't remember the name of the dong. I lived in two places, Seogyo-dong,
Seogyo-dong.
down by
Yeah.
Yonsei, and then we moved up to another dong, but I forgot the name of it. But I remember, I always told the cab driver,
Yeah, no,
Segumjeong.
This is one of the best preserved
Yeah.
town
Yes.
because of
Very
Kim
beautiful.
Shin-jo in 1969.
Yeah.
Right here,
He-
Kim Shin-jo just passes through.
Well, I was
Yeah.
living when he came
yeah.
through.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
At the
At
the time
time?
you
At the
were
right
Yeah, I
time?
was living in this area.
이건가요?
예,
내
맞습니다.
가방 아까 어디다 두셨는지 모르겠네.
There were soldiers all
Oh,
over the
yeah.
place.
Yeah.
Flares at night.
박 교수님께는 식사 가능하시면 제가 모시고 그냥 좀 저녁 식사 같이 하시고.
선생님하고 맞습니다.
네네네. 조 교수님하고 커밍스 교수님 안 되신다고 그러셔서요. 같이 그러면 조금 계시다. 같이 이숙현
이거
기자하고
정말
같이.
멋있네. Bruce,
Watch out the steps. Sorry.
this is best time to finish interview. Look at all those.
Perfect.
Wow.
Lovely.